Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our live program. And we are going to begin the session with a moment of silence for the Tibetans that have lost their lives in the uprisings and resistance, as well as to all those that have lost their lives or been persecuted by the CCP. So we're just going to have a moment of silence right now. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the moment of silence. Um, to start off today's session, my name is Pema, and I'm a Tibetan American activist with Students for a Free Tibet. And my co-moderator today is John Jones from SFT UK, who's also a Tibet campaigner. I wanted to start off the session today by just giving a brief introduction to why we decided to have this 2008 Beijing Olympics and Tibetan Uprisings panel. That was, over a decade ago. And I remember at that time I was still in elementary school, and we saw all this news going on about the Beijing Olympics and Tibetan uprisings. And we heard so much about it, but oftentimes a lot of people at that time, especially young people, didn't know a lot about what was happening on the ground or the full extent of the human rights implications. And now we see in 2022 that we're in a similar situation again. So we're hoping that this panel can open off our alternative sessions that we're having this week with some more insight into just what happened, just exactly what went on in 2008, and to better prepare us for what might be happening in 2022 as well. And so for those of you who are not aware, the IOC's 137th committee sessions are taking place right now as we speak. And today is the first day of their sessions, and the sessions will run until March 12th. So every day while the IOC hosts their sessions, they will fail to bring Tibetan voices and Uyghur voices into their narrative of the Olympics. So we are creating this alternative space, our alternative sessions, to make sure that we can amplify and really center the voices of those that are at the front lines of the CCP's brutal regime. So I want to pass it over to John now.
Thanks, Pema. It's amazing to think that even as we raise the alarm about the 2022 Winter Olympics, that the Tibet movement was actually campaigning against the Beijing Summer Olympics as far back as the year 2000. This is when it first became apparent that Beijing was bidding to host the 2008 Summer Olympics, despite its dire human rights record and its ongoing occupation of Tibet. The Tibet movement was relentless in its work, from meeting the IOC to warn them about the Games, to carrying out some huge protests and some stunning direct actions all around the world. And we're going to be hearing from some of the people involved in that today. Even behind those campaigns, Tibetans, Tibet supporters, and human rights experts all predicted that it would be a terrible decision to award the Games to Beijing. It soon became clear that the IOC did not share these concerns. Along with Chinese officials, the IOC insisted, through a string of upbeat statements, that the Games would be a force for good, that they would result in a more open China and greatly improved human rights. Beijing was awarded the Games in 2001, and the following 7 years brought no improvements. In fact, many human rights observers saw a regression. Sophie Richardson from Human Rights Watch said on the eve of the Games that the Chinese government and the International Olympic Committee have wasted a historic opportunity to use the Beijing Games to make real progress on human rights. The Tibet movement ultimately has been proven correct, although it's fair to say that even they could not have predicted what would happen in Tibet in 2008, or the level of repression that we've seen since then. This will be the topic of our discussion today. And we're going to start with one of the key people in the story of the 2008 Olympic campaign, Dunduk Wanchen, who Pam is going to talk about.
Thank you, John. So we're going to start with a special video testimony, which is from Dunduk Wanchen, who is a Tibetan activist, filmmaker, human rights defender, former political prisoner, and just overall a tremendous leader that has had a huge impact on the Tibetan movement from the Beijing Olympics moving forward. And so we're just going to actually pass it over to the video message now.
Ta poti jano mar shok jong ta ganjur chini ta lo mombo chin ru go yori ta lo mombo gi rangkang la ta po mri la dujong na sto cheme ba tang yori ta po nang ni chuti sto la le go yo mari ta mse ki nyeto ji ki lo la ta ko je chi gi olympic de jano jong la te wari ta chei chani ta je ke kang da kang na ani sidi yo sa ta ruami to tang yo sa 멍수 요사 아니 장된단 라니 요사 지게 지라 제국고요 고 자전디 청국으리 다나제 잔득 중에나 다나제 고지 지금하다 기len라면나 초축지요리 다나제 지정라면나 초축지요리 다 보너나 다 할리위다 니당 자적 부지게 올라 해요리 다 보디 지금 루리라 두른 루야마지 야지라 자니 누구요 말이 딘데 손정 다 니토 제라 다 보사 용니다 마치 칭퉁기 군이 다 잔득 중라 시용고 지요리 다 시용고 징켄디 나로니 다 자차기 주공아디 다 머리숨바 치워리 다 되게 가리 총고 요르스나 잔너 중기 제쯤 뭐랑 고kur동 주다 직준시 주데라 다 라토 사우지 주요리 다 가라이나 머리숨바 예 게토데라 아니 보사 연족라 고정주니 아니 보는 게 묘니 쓰데 로년 페니 아니 가라이나 로년 데라테니 다 루트 흐즈라 전주주요리 다 넘라 마투가 루직직 루고요리 다 제이 차니디 제치기 자춘 던톤바 잔능기 자춘 던톤바 다 잔너 머쇼 정세 되고 춘세데 자니 요하마리 달 خبر도 니르톤 뉴스 자니기 올림픽디 양초 자나라 제이와리 다티 하정이 뉴스로마다 루판구이다 내단지 치와리 다 가르시 고요스나 제치기 다 지금 구춘이다 안차용겐 다나징이 제스파 몸부치기 디시 가리 잡고요스나 자나 존티 야지 동야기 체도 아니 딘데지 자나마 소존라 다 tunki치고요. 제타 고케치고요. 진단 대시 가트이나 티적고요. 다티 하정기다 땅 지금 아주 돈원지구야 등 데라 다티 정된는 바 다티 크론즈기 김반당 크론즈기 찬연 적게 제도 임바디 사우치고요. 데 정된다 면이 쓰지 자와니 말이 데라 뜬내용이래 시템니다. 진짜 가르스나 뉴스톤 줄게 로라다 오헤니 자나 오헤니 자네딘 잠보나라 체요리 잠보능기다 단다이나다 무주 소소나 닌데게 고척치 무지 대요리다 미 치몽보기 지소쇼자리 단다이나 니탄 가다 찍게 올라 해요바팅 아주 참하게 시구야 다 지금 루아 미치 임바 차니 아주 참아 먹기 세구야디 개침불이다 디 머르기 요아메바 운니기 지금 아주 참하게 괜치 쿠니 다 지치기 단단 니톤 뉴스사니게 올림픽 팅 아주 강고치고야디 아주 참마라 기스웨빙 갱크치랑 인선치고요 다 준생가리스나 머쇼 중기 운니게 종엔디 지치랑진나다 내난진지니 체니 누구요 바이 또 정확히 무신구고리 띠 위내 난진지 건고치고야디 디링 아주라 기스웨비 링겐치 찾고요리 띠지 խბਰ도 지 머르 지 시적바치기 내던치랑 예 자와니 인선치고메 խბર도 머쇼 중기 올라댕켄기다 머르 몽부치라 다 랑징기다 강에 몽부치고요 խბર도 산제요 주기 제케 춘지 난다 다나징게 이크로와 자남 뭐 다나제 보 다나징이다 항공 다 티벤 다 딘제 몽부치란 딘제게 강에 제고요와 띵 아주 참하기다 문통학생 치와리 아니 디주 참하랑 아주 참하 독자 직지거니 공고지로지 신엔 띵이 먹으시고요 아니 루아미 아주 참하 루아미 지금 바차니 아니 참하게 되라 돈지로지 신엔 아니 디슈엔 택치나
That was Dunduk Wanchen speaking. Now we're going to introduce a panel of experts and eyewitnesses who are going to pick up the story from here. And they are detrimental from Filming for Tibet, which supports the work of Tibetan filmmakers and helped get Leaving Fear Behind out to the world. Tendor from the 2008 Everest Action Team, Tong Biao, a Chinese human rights lawyer and activist, and Mandy McEwen, a really highly regarded activist in the movement who is now with Tibet Network.
Thank you, John, for those brief bios. We are going to actually hear some opening remarks from each of the panelists and speakers now, but before we begin that, I just want to also mention for all the viewers that are tuning in today, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A, which will happen shortly after the opening remarks and some other discussion. So if anyone is tuning in, they can start sending in any Q&A questions on the comments from wherever they're streaming from. And we have a moderator who is reviewing all of those comments and questions to make sure to pull them in for our conversations here. So the first speaker who's going to be delivering their opening remarks today is Dechen Pembala.
Thank you very much, Pema Domla. Thank you, John. Thanks for having me on this panel. And it was just so surreal to see Thanda Wangchenla's message just now, because thinking back on when I met him in 2008, it was actually on this day. It was on 10th of March in Xi'an, and that was his last day of filming his documentary film, Leaving Fear Behind. And, you know, we couldn't have known back then, you know, what a significant day that was going to turn out to be. We also couldn't have known all the things that were going to happen after that. And that was actually quite fortuitous that we met on that day, because I think any time after that, it would have been impossible to film anything like what Thanda Wangchenla, Golok Jimila and their helpers had been filming in the months leading up to that day. And then it would have been impossible to even start, or it would have been inconceivable to think of a project like that after 10th of March 2008. So, you know, thinking back, it was extremely lucky. We were fortunate to have had that opportunity. And it was also smart, you know, Thanda Wangchenla conceived of the film Leaving Fear Behind, the project met a long time before, you know, that summer 2008. And he and his helpers had been traveling around all over Tibet for months, asking ordinary people their views about the Olympics and about the relationship between Tibet and China, and just their everyday sort of feelings. And that's something that's so rare. Even now, after all these years, we don't hear the voices of Tibetans inside Tibet enough. And that's the reason why I think that Leaving Fear Behind is such an important document of that time. Not to mention, you know, all the things that we can conclude about the Olympics, about how China used the Olympics in 2008 for their own purposes, and completely silenced the voices of Tibetans and many of their own people as well. I mean, after we had met, the plan was for Thanda Wangchenla to go back to his home area, but with the uprising that started in Lhasa and then spread throughout the whole of Tibet very quickly, he was going back to a lot of turmoil and a lot of unrest, with protests going on, protests being violently suppressed, huge crackdown happening, and he disappeared, and we didn't know what happened to him. And the same for Golok Jimila. And for many months, there was so much uncertainty. I was at the time based in Beijing, so I had gone to Xi'an to meet him, and then gone back to Beijing, and all I was hearing was phone calls from people who were concerned. And what was quite interesting is that a lot of calls I was getting were from people outside China, who were asking, you know, if I was okay, if I had heard what was happening, if I knew what was going on. That just goes to show you how difficult it is for information to even get out of Tibet, and for information to reach people who are in China, because the protests that had started in Lhasa had really spread. You know, this was unlike anything that had happened in 87, 89, where protests had happened, but they were mainly contained in Lhasa. But even though social media wasn't quite, you know, as advanced as it is now, people were making calls, sending a lot of SMS text messages, and the word was just spreading about, you know, the monks protesting in Lhasa. And if you look at a map of where the protests happened, it's incredible how fast they spread and how they were not just in Tibet, or they weren't just in Lhasa, they weren't just in Tibet autonomous region. They were all over Kham, all over Amdo. And also being based in Beijing, I had so many Tibetan friends who were very, very worried about their family back home. A lot of places, we kind of think that the protests happened in maybe only big cities or areas with large populations, but protests were happening everywhere in, small villages. And friends that I had who had family in small villages were really worried. They were like, our village is so small, but now 17 people have gone missing. And the fear, the anxiety was creeping all the way, I would say, to Beijing, because later on down the line, a few months down the line, I was meeting Tibetans in Beijing who had basically escaped and fled for their lives, fearing arrest and fearing repercussions of protesting, and they were sort of in hiding. And there was this fear and anxiety, and I think that was really symbolic of, a lot of people's feelings and anxiety leading up to the Olympics, because no Tibetans, at the time were excited about the Olympics. Nobody really, the whole years and the hype leading up to the Beijing Summer Olympics 2008, no Tibetans were excited about it. No one thought that the situation would improve. And this is really evident when you watch the film Leaving Fear Behind. So, Tunda Wantanla spending 6 years in prison, Golok Jimila being arrested many times, tortured for making the film, just for airing the views of ordinary Tibetans. So in a way, since that experience, and I was also deported from Beijing 1 month before the Olympics started, because the authorities didn't want any Tibetans from outside. They didn't want any Tibetans. Tibetans in Beijing were also going missing. They didn't want anything to upset their games that summer. So it was a really intense time, many months of just fear, not knowing what had happened, a lot of, violent crackdown on peaceful protesters. So when I think back, it's bringing back a lot of memories of that time, but it was extremely, I also think it was extremely historic and important. And also, as Pamadomla was saying at the beginning, to have the voices of Tibetans inside Tibet being so strong, being heard outside, and then at the same time sort of inspiring a new generation of activists. Here we are, 12, 13 years down the line, still talking about it. And we have, a lot of people who were sort of, your generation, sort of younger generation, hearing the voices of Tibetans inside Tibet. And that had happened for a previous generation from the protests in 87, 89. So I do think it's very significant. And I would urge anyone who hasn't seen the film Leaving Fear Behind to watch it. It's available on YouTube. It's freely available to watch, because sadly, I don't think the issues have really changed or improved. And if you watch the documentary film, all the things that the Tibetans are saying about the Olympics then, I think it could also apply now. So I think I'll leave my remarks at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dechen. Next, we're going to hear from Tendor about actions by the Tibet movement inside Tibet and in exile.
Thank you, John. I hope people can hear me. Yeah. Hi, everyone. So when I think of 2008, actually, it was a little bit unnerving hearing Pema Doma say earlier that in 2008, when the uprising was happening in Tibet, that she was in elementary school. Every time something like that happens, it's kind of a strange reminder how long ago it was. And I think, for many of us, I think for almost a whole generation of Tibetans, both inside Tibet as well as in exile, 2008 marked a really unique period in not just in Tibetan history, but in the individual life of every single one of us. It was kind of a crucible, kind of a trial by fire moment. And I think 2008, what happened in 2008 basically proved the power of the Tibetan movement. I think it proved the power of the Tibetan people. I remember 2008 as kind of a peak performance kind of moment for the Tibetan freedom struggle, and also a moment of Chinese vulnerability. It was a moment that really showed the Chinese government's vulnerability in that period. And I think there was a time around early 2000, the early years after 2001 to, when a lot of people were kind of speculating, so many things have changed inside Tibet, and maybe the Tibet movement is now finished, or there isn't much left of it. There were all of these predictions or speculations. And 2007 and then 2008, the years leading to 2008, and then the uprising itself in Tibet of 2008, that really proved all of those voices wrong. And it was an awakening, a political awakening that is as significant or more significant than the 1987 uprising. And for the reasons that Dejunla explained, the 1987 uprising was mostly confined to Lhasa and some of the bigger towns, whereas 2008 was a nationwide event that unfolded all over Tibet. But another thing that makes 2008 different and unique is also the fact that I think 2008 was not necessarily a spontaneous kind of uprising or a spontaneous protest or event. The Tibetan people really noticed and observed the timing of the Olympics. And somehow, unlike the 1987 protests, which were directly in response to global events that were happening day by day, and the news broadcasts that were being done by the Chinese government, 2008 was really the Tibetan people basically making a decision that this is our time. This is the time to express our desire for freedom, to express our desire for self-determination. And it really demonstrated to the Chinese government and to the entire world that the Tibetan people desire freedom and self-determination. And we want a Tibet that is free and independent. So I think in that sense, the 2008 moment is really unique and special for every Tibetan out there. And on the side of the Tibet movement globally, I think just like the Tibetans inside were basically, working at their peak capability, the Tibet movement was also firing on all cylinders in 2008. Every single organization that ever existed was activated during that period, right? Every single individual turned into an activist during the day or during the night. I really I've yet to meet a single Tibetan who was not active in 2008, who did not become activated after that. So I think for those reasons, it was a really special moment for the Tibet movement. And also, I think the Tibet movement in exile did a phenomenal job leading up to that 2008 moment, because in the years leading up to it, I was working with the Students for Free Tibet at the time, and me and my colleagues were working very closely with Tibet Network. We were working with Tibetan Youth Association in Switzerland, and also with the Tibetan Youth Congress and the Tibetan Women's Association. So it was and a few other NGOs, and we really had a strong coordinated network that was highly organized, that was also partly decentralized, so that each organization was able to improvise and make decisions on its own, but at the same time we were well coordinated and communicating at such a pace that we were truly able to plan together, right? It wasn't just about expressions of solidarity. It was really sitting down and planning in advance together, a couple of years in advance, whether it's planning a march to Tibet or whether it's planning the protests that we were able to deploy in China in 2008 August. So for a number of those activities, there was a real presence of coordination and advanced planning going on together. And that, I think, really accounted for a great deal of the success of the campaign, the 2008 Olympics campaign. And when I say success, I think, it fundamentally changed a few things. And one, it changed the Tibet movement itself. It really showed to every single Tibetan and our supporters and friends the real capability of the Tibet movement once it is activated, or once all the muscles are working, right? And it also showed to the Chinese government what the Tibet movement can do or could do. So I think so in all those things, it was a really important moment. And then after 2008, some of the things that happened, the Chinese government, at the same time, it also benefited from hosting the games. And that's part of the IOC story. Basically, after 2008, the Chinese government, even as it suffered damage to its reputation vis-a-vis Tibet, domestically within China, in the years following 2008, the domestic legitimacy of the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, it was bolstered within the Chinese people in China proper, in a sense that IOC giving the Olympics to China in 2008 really benefited the Chinese government, and it allowed the Chinese government to strengthen itself, to consolidate power, and it put the Chinese government in an ideal position where it can conduct its genocide against the Uyghur people now, right? It put the Chinese government in a position to recolonize Hong Kong. Without 2008, it might have been much harder for the Chinese government to do what it's doing in dismantling democracy in Hong Kong and in basically eradicating the Uyghur ethnic group in Xinjiang right now, or in East Turkestan. And then it also allowed the Chinese government to basically impose a reign of terror in Tibet with its apparatus of surveillance, and basically it really put Tibet in a condition where we had more than 155 or 160 self-immolations by Tibetan people. So the IOC, the fact that it's giving the Olympics to China, it's hosting the Olympics in China again in 2022, what that really means is the IOC is telling China to go ahead with its crackdown in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and in Hong Kong. So it's absolutely something that should not proceed, and it's encouraging that the Tibetans are now working with the Uyghurs and Hong Kong people and Chinese Democrats to put a stop, to intervene and put a stop to the atrocities. So that's, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Tenderla. I think that you gave us a lot of things to think about and a lot of discussion starting points, which we will definitely dive deeper into once we open the question discussion portion of the panel today. So the next moderator who I would like to invite to give their opening remarks is Tang Biao.
Thank you very much. A few days before the Tibetan uprising in 2008, I was kidnapped by Chinese secret police because I wrote a letter, open letter with human rights activist Hu Jia 1 year before the Beijing Summer Olympics, and calling for the international community paying more attention to the human rights situation in China. And Hu Jia was later arrested and eventually sentenced 3 years and a half imprisonment. And I was trying to be his defense lawyer. And then I was detained and tortured. And after the Tibetan uprising, I organized a group of human rights lawyers, more than 20 Chinese, Han Chinese human rights lawyers, had an open letter expressing our willingness to defend the Tibetans arrested and detained or disappeared. And we had limited knowledge at that time, because the Chinese government controlled the information very severely. But we knew as lawyers, we were clear that the arbitrary detention and torture and enforced disappearance were all rampant after the Tibetan uprising. But the Chinese government was very angry at our open letter, and Tibetan issue at that time was the most sensitive issue, and we were all warned by the Judiciary Bureau, and a few months later, there's a couple of months before the Beijing Summer Olympics, I and another human rights lawyer were disbarred. So 2 years later, I got the opportunity to defend for Tibetan intellectual who was sentenced to 3 years because he edited a Tibetan magazine, and but I was refused to meet him in the detention center. And when the trial was taking place, I myself was detained again because of the Jasmine crackdown. So the Beijing Summer Olympics has been a stage for the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda, and was as excuse for the Chinese government to violate human rights and suppress fundamental freedom. So, you know, to some extent, 2008, the year 2008 and the Beijing Olympics can be seen as a turning point. You know, for the past 6-7 years, Xi Jinping has changed China's political landscape to a great extent, but this was not happening suddenly. And many scholars and observers realized that the year 2008 has been a turning point. They had used these kind of measures to control the society at that time. So it is politically and morally wrong to let Beijing host the Beijing Summer Olympics, and it's extremely wrong to let it host the Beijing Winter Olympics again. Yeah, and that's the message I sent to the international community by the op-ed I wrote for the Washington Post. Yes.
Thank you, Tong Byung. Our last panelist is Mandy McEwen from the Tibet Network.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be here to join this esteemed panel. I mean, on the back of all that, I wanted to raise the issue about you know, how the IOC got into this situation. And the reality is that the IOC, governments and sponsors really failed to take all the necessary action that was needed to insist that China made any positive and any tangible change when it comes to human rights. And this inaction continued even though it was obvious. You know, Beijing gave really distinct signs that it had no intentions of keeping to the promises that it had made to the international community, no intention of being able to you know, live up to what it has said it would do in exchange for being awarded the privilege of hosting the games. And as Tendor raised so eloquently, you know, there was a really strong, sophisticated campaign by global Tibet groups in exile, but also renowned human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, Human Rights in China, all providing gallons of evidence concerning China's extreme and worsening human rights atrocities at the time, evidence that really needed to be used in a compelling way to get governments and IOCs to take more solid action. But the reality was that the IOC literally refused for years to even acknowledge Tibet as an issue, and it wasn't actually until thousands, as Tendor and Dechen raised, thousands of brave Tibetans inside Tibet literally took to the streets across the whole of Tibet, you know, speaking really loudly out despite China's brutal crackdown. But it was this uprising that really made the IOC have to respond. And it has to be said that the action that the IOC did at the time was predominantly piecemeal. It was far less than was desperately required. So, for example, just after the outbreak, so the outbreak started in around 10th of March 2008. By the end of March, the then IOC president, Jacques Rogge, stated that he was in, and these are his words, he was engaged in silent diplomacy with China on Tibet and on other human rights issues. You know, in light of the uprising in Tibet, Olympic Games sponsors and governments and the IOC were compelled to respond to mounting questions in relation to the support that they were giving to Beijing and Chinese leadership. And this created huge public embarrassment for the IOC, but also for Chinese leaders. You know, Chinese leaders had to finally be pinpointed for not living up to everything that they had said they would live up to. And further than that, the uprising and this situation reinforced the reality, and a reality which is still there today, that Tibet remains one of the most critical issues really facing China. So all of this combined started to show some serious cracks in the images that the Chinese leaders had hoped to have of this perfect Olympics, and you know, Chinese organizers really wanted to present themselves both domestically to their own kind of citizens, but also internationally as being unquestionable, and you know, this was the huge coming out party for the Chinese Communist Party. again, the Tibetan Uprising was this moment in time when slowly world leaders had to really start to wake up to the fact that 2008, the 2008 Games, were not going to make any of the changes that the Chinese government had said, or the IOC had led us to believe were going to happen when it came to China's attitude to human rights. And leaders did start to respond. They started to respond slowly. So, for example, after the London torch relay, the British Prime Minister at the time, Gordon Brown, stated then that he was not going to attend the opening ceremony, and this was despite the fact that for months and months there had been contradicting statements saying that the UK government would definitely be attending. So in the end, by the time the Olympics were opening, we counted that there were at least 27 world leaders who did not show up to the opening ceremony. And a number of those did directly cite that Tibet and the Tibetan Uprising and China's crackdown in Tibet was the reason why they were not joining. You know, and now 12 years later, we kind of find ourselves in the same position, really. But the IOC finds itself in an even worse position. You know, they have failed for a second time. They have failed again to address the reality of the human rights situation in China. And, you know, this willful ignorance just cannot go unchallenged by us. And one of the reasons we've come here today is to kind of face up to this reality and to really bring together some of the points that we know need to be addressed to ensure that the IOC know again how badly they have failed. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Mandy, and all of the other panelists for the really insightful opening remarks to get us started. And I do want to just note that we are going to have one more panelist joining us today, actually, which we're really excited about. So we will have Sophie Richardson, who is the China Director at Human Rights Watch, joining us for the question and answer portion and the discussion portion. Hi, Sophie. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, especially a bit late. Apologies. And it's always great to be with such terrific friends and amazing advocates.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that with all your experience and insight and expertise, it will add a lot to the discussion as well. So we're really happy to have you with us today.
Great.
So we're going to start off the discussion and question and answer portion of the panel today with the first question. So all of the panelists have shared a lot about details about experiences they've had or facts that they've learned about over the years pertaining to 2008. And so the first question is, if you had to describe the entire experience, the culminating experience of the 2008 Olympics, the campaign experience, and the uprisings inside Tibet, if you had to describe it in one word about how that felt for you, how that journey felt for you, what word would that be, and why would you use that word to describe? So you can feel free to share any experiences or story that you think kind of shape your perspective of that entire time period for you. And I know that's a very big question, so hopefully folks can just, you know, give it their best shot, whatever best fits.
Should I just jump in really quickly?
Absolutely.
For me, I would say it was life changing, and I don't mean that for any kind of personal reasons and for the activities that I was involved in, but more up till 2008. You know, there had been sporadic small protests during my time in the movement, which started in 2000. And I think for us to forget those moments of how we felt when we saw the images of those thousands of Tibetans taking to the streets of Lhasa. You know, it was literally life-changing, and I know so many of us in the movement at that time still remember not being able to sleep because we were desperately looking at our Blackberries of the time to find more news and to see what was happening, and we were totally enveloped in this moment of huge resistance, and it was inspirational. That's me.
Thank you, Mandy. Would any of the other panelists like to answer this question?
I'll give it a try, Pema, but can I pick 2 words?
Yeah, sure thing. For you.
Thanks. It's lovely to be here. I think it was enraging in who would not do what, you know, with respect to commitments made and then just manifestly tossed aside, and to see just how how profoundly uninterested people with certain kinds of power were in trying to leave a lasting positive legacy. But it was also energizing, I think, not just for the reasons that Mandy describes. I mean, I remember being riveted by those images, but also, you know, and Teng Laosher will no doubt have things to say about this. You know, it was a time when there was a lot of, or there was a lot more activism possible inside the country. You know, there were collaborations between, for example, human rights lawyers and people in Tibet who wanted to be represented by those lawyers. You know, I think even for the kind of broader community that we all operate in outside the country, I have found myself reflecting in the last couple of weeks about, you know, how our community would be different now if we hadn't kind of had that experience all together. I think it sort of brought a number of us together in ways that have better prepared us, you know, to deal with you know, this enormous threat that we're confronting now. And I think we are collectively stronger for that. Maybe that's a little overly optimistic, but I think that was one part of the experience, at least for me. I'm very keen to hear what others think.
Yeah, I can jump in here and recall the moment when I got a phone call from Radio Free Asia, a friend at Radio Free Asia, who said, "Oh, Tenla, wake up!" You know, this was very early in the morning, and I was usually sleeping at that time. So the phone call, there was a voicemail, and she had said, wake up! You know, the uprising has begun." And this was the day when the uprising had begun in Lhasa, and to me, that moment, the word that comes to mind now is agency. The day when Tibetans decided to take matters into their own hands. Up until that moment, for several years, Tibet would be discussed in the media or between governments or between organizations, mostly as an issue, right? As an issue of importance. But the Tibetan people were usually victims of history rather than agents of history. And 2008 was the year when Tibetans became agents of history, taking matters into their own hands. So for me, the word is agency.
Yeah, for me, the word might be disaster. During Beijing Olympics and a few months before that, I was kidnapped by the secret police and tortured. I was banned from teaching. My passport was confiscated, and I was disbarred. So it's a disaster for me and for many other Chinese human rights activists. They were detained and sentenced and tortured. And of course, it's a disaster for Tibetans. So many people were detained in prisons and disappeared, and some died in custody. And since 2009, more than 150 Tibetan people self-humiliated, so it's a disaster. And one more thing some people may not know is because of the Beijing Olympics, it covered up the outbreak of melamine milk powder scandal, and the news was delayed for several months, and because of that, many innocent children consumed the poisonous milk powder. So we can see the similar thing last year because of the cover up by the Chinese government. The whole world are still suffering the coronavirus.
I think that if I had to, when I think about that time, you know, what word springs to mind is just the sort of how it was very intense, like just the intensity of everything that was happening was so heightened. Like, I feel like that must be what it feels like when you live through a revolution where there's all this change happening. You know, every day there would be news of something happening, and it was on such a scale, you know, like I mentioned before, the protests were so widespread. They were so, you know, they were so massive in, you know, number of participants in the, you know, space of the area where it happened, even to the sort of solidarity vigils and protests held by Tibetans in cities in China. And something very strange and scary happened in China, that suddenly all Tibetans were being portrayed by Chinese state media as terrorists and separatists. And I remember sitting on the bus in Beijing going somewhere, and there was a TV, and it was showing CCTV non-stop footage of, you know, violence and riots. And so it became a really scary time to be a Tibetan in China. And I think that, you know, those few months were really something else. And then, of course, you had the Sichuan earthquake in 2008 and the lead up to the Olympics, which I don't think got mentioned yet. And, you know, the subsequent crackdown in Tibet was so huge that, you know, for the, you know, after 2008, you know, 2009, it was so quiet, you know, you almost didn't hear anything, which maybe was even worse. I don't know, until you know, get to the self-immolations and things. So it was just so many, it was very tumultuous and very, very intense time.
Thanks, Dechen, and thanks everyone for giving us those answers. We have one more set question, but before I read it, I think I'll just remind those of you that are watching today, thanks for joining us. We do have a great panel, so let's use them. If you've got any questions about 2008, then do put them in the comments and we'll try and read as many as we can. But the next question for everyone on the panel is, what would you tell the IOC about their decision to hold yet another Games in Beijing? The screen has focused on Dechen.
I just can't believe that. It's very easy. I mean, I can just be very quick. I just cannot believe that after everything that happened in 2008, that no lessons have been learned. I mean, it's just completely. I was so shocked, and I can't believe that it's all sort of happening again. It's just completely, to me, just inconceivable.
Sophie, before you joined us, I actually read your some words that you issued on the eve of the 2008 Games, and I wonder what your impressions are of the Winter Olympics taking place in Beijing next year.
I'm glad you read them. I can't remember what I wrote or said then.
They were damning.
You know, some of my colleagues have done enormous work with the IOC over the last decade or so to try to get it to adopt certain human rights standards and sort of good business practices and human rights due diligence. And I maybe a bit like Tibetan, I struggle for the right adjective to describe not just the gulf between the aspirations that the IOC has set out, on paper versus what it's doing or expecting for this next round of games in Beijing, but just the wanton denial, the profound lack of interest in the consequences for real human beings' lives as a result of these games. The almost, I really can't struggle for a word to describe it, the unwillingness to acknowledge a connection between the 2008 games and terrible consequences for people, and a willingness to do that all over again. I mean, let's think back to the Lhasa torch relay. What's going to happen this time? Are they going to run it through Urumqi? There's no there's no uptake. It's almost like dealing with a little child that claps its hands over its ears and just repeats, "I am a force for good. The Olympics are a force for good," over and over and over again, when we know that people were detained and died in detention. Let's think about Ji Suzlun. And the fact that 12 years later, the world is dealing with Chinese government that is exponentially more repressive than it was in 2008. And the IOC just doesn't seem to care. It just doesn't seem to care. And I think it's very hard, to deal with an entity that is so obviously disinterested in those human consequences and just spinning itself a happy story instead.
I would have a question for the IOC, and the moment that serves as the best analogy for what's happening right now. So we are 1 year out, looking ahead to the 2022 games, and we have all of these concentration camps in Xinjiang, and more than 1 million Uyghurs and Kazakhs and other Muslims detained in those concentration camps. And we have now, even though the full scale of the horrors are not completely out in the open, there has been enough evidence from first-hand witnesses, first-hand victims and testimonials. We have enough evidence to know what's going on there, right? Now, so we all know about the 1936 games, the Nazi Olympics. If the Nazi government had hosted the Olympics in 1942, if they had hosted the Olympics in 1942, and the world knew, IOC knew about the concentration camps that were being run at that time, right? During that height, would the IOC still have gone ahead with those games in 1942? And also the other question is for democratic governments or free nations. Would these governments participate in such an event? If the 1936 Nazi Olympics had taken place in 1942, would you have gone, right? If the answer is no, then the answer right now should be no to 2022.
Actually, I did have the opportunity to talk to the IOC officials directly in October last year. Hello. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, I did have the chance to talk to them directly, and I told them my own experience, and that China used the Olympics as an excuse to violate human rights, and China did not keep its commitment, and the human rights situation had been deteriorating after that, and it was proven totally wrong that to use the Olympics to promote the, open society and freedom in China. That's a naive idea and has been proven wrong. So, but this time I think the IOC knows well that the Olympics, the next year's Olympics, will not promote human rights and will make China's human rights even worse. But they just don't care. So it's a betrayal to the Olympic Charter. It's a betrayal to universal values. So yeah, and I'm so disappointed that IOC's attitude. They have been accomplice of Beijing's human rights violation, and I think we should call this Olympics as genocide Olympics.
I did want to ask Mandy that question as well, but I think she's temporarily dropped out. Because indeed, she was one of several activists who have met the IOC in the run to the Winter Games, and she's coming back here. So, Mandy, I don't know how your connection is, but I just wanted to put that question to you as well, as someone who has checked in with the IOC recently. It's not exactly a hypothetical question. Maybe you can tell us what you and the other activists did tell them.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think it's really simple. I mean, everyone's summed it up pretty well. I think really the question I still want answered is, where are these written assurances? When you gave the 2022 Games to Beijing, you told us categorically that you had written assurances from China. We want to see those. You told us we could see them. Where are they? And also, where is the due diligence report concerning the 2022 Games? How can you once again have not put forward a due diligence report when you know the situation we were in 2008? Really simple questions, and really simple for them to answer. They must have these answers at their fingertips, and they are refusing to put them forward to us. And that's what I would like from them right now.
Thank you, Mandy. And I think if that wraps up the answers from the panelists for that question from John, I do want to just plug quickly, actually, because Changbao had mentioned genocide games, and that is actually the theme of our panel for the alternative sessions tomorrow. And we also have a press briefing on Friday, which will go more in depth about some communications activists have had with the IOC. So there will be more on that one as well. And so the next question we have is from the audience. And the question is, resistance in Tibet is much harder now than it was even in 2008. And how do you foresee this impacting any campaigning or protesting of the Winter Olympics? And I think it would also be great to hear from the panelists about what some of those differences might be, either the conditions wise between 2008 and now, which you can foresee impacting some of the conditions that campaigners and activists have to work with.
I can jump in and quickly share just one thought. I think it's extremely difficult to predict what kind of resistance we will or won't see inside Tibet in terms of political mobilization or political expressions of people's desire for self-determination. One thing we know is there is already a lot of resistance happening inside Tibet right now in 100 different ways, and the form or the expression of resistance right now may be not exactly the type of street protests that we used to see in 2008, but we have been hearing about and seeing a great deal of resistance in other realms, in other forms of resistance, whether those are simple, small, daily acts of resistance in terms of practicing one's culture, practicing the language, because it's not only the lack of political freedoms that Tibetan people are suffering from, it's the direct attack on Tibetan culture, the assault on Tibetan language, right? The assault on people's faith. So as much as the realms of repression has increased, Tibetan people are finding many ways through which to resist and challenge these encroachments on people's cultural freedoms and cultural practices. So there is a great deal of resistance already going on. The other question is also how much resistance we will see within Tibet also depends on how much support and how much solidarity we receive from the world. The more solidarity and support we receive from the free world, from people of conscience around the world, the more encouragement and the more courage people actually receive to organize resistance on the ground. So during some of the darkest times in Tibetan history, if you look back at the years in the 1960s and the 70s and the 1980s, one of the biggest, there are lots of number of different factors that determine the level of resistance inside Tibet, but one of the factors that really predict how much resistance and how much activity we see, it really depends on the amount of global support and solidarity for the Tibetan people. So that's really important part.
I can maybe add a few words to this, if that's okay, because I agree with Tendola that it's very difficult to predict what will happen inside Tibet. We didn't know that there was a film like Leaving Fear Behind that was so powerful that would be coming out. We didn't know that this big uprising would be taking place. And from the outside, if you had asked anybody, from the big uprising in Lhasa in 1989 to 2008, there were sort of intermittent small protests you heard about, but from the outside, to someone who wasn't really observing closely, it would look like nothing's happening in Tibet. And that's always the issue, because people sort of seem to think that when Tibet disappears from the headlines that there's nothing going on, because you just can't, you can't see it. It's so hard to get information out. But there are acts of resistance going on, as Tendola said. And I think that in the run-up to next year, now that we have this year, which is a big chance for campaigners outside, it's really time to amplify the voices of people who were directly impacted in 2008, like Tendawang Chenla, like Golok Jimila, Tang Biao. Your experiences as well are so valuable, because these are directly linked to the Olympics, and the IOC has a responsibility to, this is what we've been talking about on this panel. So I think that, if we can highlight the real life, the lived experiences of people who went through this in 2008, and I think that it's really an opportunity to show the IOC what a responsibility they have and how life-changing for the worse, their actions really are, or really can be.
Did anyone else have anything to add? Otherwise, I can go to the next question. Okay, and this one is, does the IOC not care? Is that because they're dependent on China's money? Is this an extension of the debt trap diplomacy? I wonder who would like to go first with this question. Perhaps we can start with the easy part. Does the IOC even care?
I'm happy to take a stab at that. We've met periodically with the IOC. really since 2008, and not just on games in China, but the 2014 games in Sochi, which was the one other repressive environment in which games have taken place since the 2008 round. I think the IOC cares about having what it thinks of as successful Olympics. And that means that people can compete, that there are splashy opening and closing ceremonies, that that money gets made, that people can attend, and the kinds of things I think that our community and people who are affected, outside the community of athletes or participants, really just don't enter into their calculation, or to the extent they do, they're seen as a problem. I think the IOC does care about its reputation, but only in some very specific ways. I think it will be very interesting to see over the coming years whether the IOC decides to avoid having games or agreeing to have games in authoritarian countries because of the reputational costs. I think it's going to be very interesting to see if some of the kinds of activism by athletes now, which is a real and powerful phenomenon, will help push the IOC to comply with its own standards. I have to say, I'm never going to be an Olympic athlete, you all know me, but I think if I happened to be one and I had the views that I have about human rights and the world, I would be very angry about being expected to go compete in this kind of environment. And I really wonder whether that kind of sense is bubbling up and going to create some positive pressure on national Olympic committees and on the International Olympic Committee. But I think if the IOC really was serious about the commitments it's made on paper, or wants us to believe, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now, because there wouldn't be another round of the games inside China.
Thank you, Sophie. I would like to open it up and see if any of the other panelists want to try that question as well, or have anything to add to the answer that Sophie gave. Okay, great. Well, we do have a lot more Q&A questions coming in from the audience, so I think that we can go to the next question as well. So the next question that we had from the audience was, how should ordinary Tibetan and Chinese people build solidarity in the face of increasing PRC government repression, especially in the diaspora? And for this question, I did want to pass it over to Tang Biao first and see if there's anything that you wanted to say in response to this question, Tang Biao.
Yeah, it's very important to have the solidarity between Tibetan people and Chinese people. In China, many Han Chinese intellectuals and ordinary people want to show our support and solidarity, but it's very difficult and very risky. And the problem is the Chinese propaganda, and they resort to nationalism sentiment, the discrimination against ethnic minorities, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and so the official propaganda see this issue as like related to territory integrity, as the executives of the CCP to put people into the so-called re-education camps is to fight terrorism, separatism, and extremism, and similar in Tibet, and the official media tell the people that those Tibetans want to be independent, want to separate from China, but in for the people, Tibetan and Chinese living in overseas, we have seen like a mutual support. That's I and other Chinese activists want to support Tibetan cause, and we respect the Tibetan people's choice. For the past years, we organize protests together, campaigns together, and including the online campaigns. So we can do that, and we should do that, and we should strengthen that kind of solidarity.
Thank you, Tongbiao. Would any of the other panelists like to add anything to that question as well?
Okay, should we move on? I've got another question here, and it's, what is the best way allies can support these frontline communities with the No Beijing 2022 Olympics campaign?
I'll just quickly add that the first step for allies and supporters to help out in this particular campaign, and also in general, is to overcome the mentality that it's not going to make a difference. I think that's right now, that's the single biggest barrier to making a positive difference for human rights and freedom for the people and places oppressed by the Chinese government right now. There's a lot of people who, and sometimes, people really believe because they don't know better, they do not have the information, they do not know the history, and that's why they believe that challenging the Chinese government is going to be useless or futile or not going to make a difference, right? A lot of times there are people who are actually doing the bidding of the Chinese government purposely or intentionally. So you'll find these people in business, you'll find them in academia, you'll find them sometimes even among supposed, allies, right? Who will say, don't push for a boycott, or don't push for changing the Olympics from China and moving it elsewhere. Don't push for self-determination. Don't talk about democracy. Don't talk about freedom. Minimize your demand, reduce your demand, ask for something less. People always do this. And there was a question earlier after somebody who asked, what can we tell many of the exiled Tibetans who believe that activism and advocacy will not make a difference for Tibetans inside Tibet? This is the kind of thinking that the Chinese government wants us to believe in, and nothing we do will matter, right? So if more and more and more people believe like that, believe along those lines, that nothing we do will matter, then the Chinese government really has won. So one of the things you can do to make sure that this doesn't happen is actually yourself start to believe that everything you do will actually make a difference. And it's not even what you do on the ground or in the street or in the halls of power. Even what you believe in your mind right now will make a difference. So if you change your attitude and start believing that actually, a small action will actually make a difference, and I'm going to take part in this, that new kind of mentality will actually bring more people into the realm of advocacy and start taking action enough that will change history. So I think the mentality has to change before anything else changes.
Mandy, did you have anything to add as a veteran campaigner?
Yeah, sure. And apologies, I keep disappearing. My internet connection seems to be a bit off. Yeah, I mean, Tyndall's absolutely right. The small actions built together are what enable change, and we see change from people taking action all of the time. We recently had a very successful campaign about Google, and a successful campaign about Apple, campaigns that people believed would not be successful. And this is the same, being able to support frontline communities' activities is definitely relatively easy. at the moment, simply sharing information online, following spokespeople and representing their views and sharing their views online is definitely something which is really easy to do, but also something as individuals who live in predominantly democratic countries, contacting your elected representative, telling them what you think about your government giving support to the Games is something that you can do really easily. Sending an email to your elected representative, asking them to ask a question in your parliament or your House of Representatives, you know, posing the idea that your government should not be supporting these Olympics. You know, really actually very easy things to do as constituents, and I urge everybody to take that up and to do it as soon as possible.
Sorry, Sophie, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm going to unsurprisingly sound a little bit like Mandy and Tandor, but you know, there's no one true path, I think, in demonstrating to the world that you care about something. So whether it is, you know, as Mandy suggests, calling your MP, or whether it's writing a letter to the editor of your local paper, or calling the head of your country's National Olympic Committee and saying, how do you feel about this? Or, you know, inviting a dialogue with a famous athlete from your country on social media around these kinds of issues. I think, you know, I think frontline communities such as they are take a lot of support and energy from seeing people out organizing their own communities. If it's a university, if it's a community group, if it's a church group, if it's athletes, you know, that's a wonderful thing to see, to know that other communities are engaged and will spend, you know, the time and the effort to demonstrate that concern. I think that can be a very powerful way of energizing others.
Can I just say one last thing, following on from that, is that there are a wealth of resources and materials available by Tibet groups and Uyghur groups and Hong Kongers who are all actively working on these groups. So you should go out and find those and take action. And I think at the end of this there will be some websites shared where you can find some of those resources.
Thank you, Mandy, and thanks to all of our speakers today. I think that's a great place to start wrapping things up. There is a website about the campaign, nobeijing2022.org, and this is the first of 3 alternative sessions that are happening this week. I believe the next one's happening at the same time tomorrow on the Genocide Games, with a whole new panel of experts. And I think it's just worth adding to all of the sort of brilliant information and answers that our panelists have given us, that this is a campaign that's clearly going places. It already has momentum behind it. We're seeing support that certainly I can see in the UK, and I'm sure our friends in the US and around the world will agree with that. So do check out the website and do get involved. And for those of us that have watched the session today, really thank you for tuning in and your questions. And that just leaves me to thank Mandy McEwen, Dechin Pemba, Sophie Richardson, Tendor, Tong Biao, and my amazing co-host as well, Pema, who invited me along to co-host this with her. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to John as well.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.